There is a 40-year-old Korean company that makes memory chips, the kind of chip that serves as the working memory inside computers and servers. So standardized that for most of its existence, the only thing that distinguished one manufacturer from another was price. It nearly went bankrupt. Twice. Its name changed 3 times. It spent years as the unloved division of an industrial conglomerate, quietly trying to survive in one of the most brutal commodity businesses on earth. And then, in the past year, its stock rose tenfold or 1000% because investors across the world realized that it was one of the most critical players enabling the AI boom. It became one of South Korea's $2 trillion companies alongside Samsung. It turned out that the chip it made, the one nobody outside the industry could name, was the one thing the artificial intelligence industry could not build without. That company is SK Hynix, and the story of how it got there, starting from 1983, contains some of the most transferable lessons in business strategy you're likely to find. But today's story is not about how SK Hynix ended up at the center of the AI boom. That story is worth telling, and we will come back to it in a future video. Today's story is about something that happened 40 years earlier in the company's first decade that contains a counterintuitive lesson about risk that matters well beyond the semiconductor industry. Here is what popular culture gets wrong about how businesses succeed. The stories that get told are about people who took the biggest risks, start the company, bet everything on the new idea, go all in before anyone else does. We celebrate that narrative because it makes for great storytelling. But some of the biggest and most durable business successes in history were built by doing something closer to the opposite. Not eliminating risk, but being ruthlessly deliberate about which risks to take and when. Because whether you're building a company, launching a product, changing careers, or leading a team, the same question keeps showing up. How do you grow without betting the entire future on one decision? What if success was possible by asking a different question? Which risks can we remove first? That is what makes this story so interesting. Here is the arc in brief. For most of SK Hynix's history, it sold one of the most commoditized products in the technology industry: standard memory chips. The kind inside every laptop and server where every manufacturer's chip is interchangeable with every other manufacturer's, and the only thing that matters is price. It was a brutal business. Margins collapsed every few years when too many chips flooded the market. Companies went bankrupt, and SK Hynix itself nearly did twice. But somewhere in the middle of all that commodity chaos, the company was quietly building a manufacturing capability so deep and so specific that when the AI industry arrived looking for something no one else could make, SK Hynix was the only company ready to deliver it. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to South Korea in 1983. Not to a startup, not to a founder with a breakthrough idea, to a government industrial policy and a group of Korean manufacturers who had a problem they could no longer ignore. By 1983, semiconductors were becoming embedded in virtually every industrial product Korea's manufacturers made. Semiconductors are the silicon chips that control electronics, process data, and store memory. They were showing up in engine control systems in cars, navigation equipment on ships, and process control systems in the heavy machinery the Hyundai Group was building and exporting. Every one of those chips was imported almost entirely from Japan. That dependency was not neutral. Japan's chip supply served Japanese interests first. If a trade dispute disrupted the flow, or if Japan decided to prioritize its own manufacturers, Korean industry had no fallback. The Korean government's response was a program called the Semiconductor Industry Development Plan, launched in 1982 and 1983. The logic was straightforward: subsidize Korean companies to build domestic chip fabrication so that Korea's industrial base would not be held hostage to foreign suppliers. Favorable loans, tax incentives, infrastructure support. The government would co-sign the risk for any company willing to build a factory. One of those companies was the Hyundai Group, which in 1983 founded what it called Hyundai Electronics. The problem it set out to solve was not a narrow market gap. It was a national supply chain vulnerability, and the first customer it aimed to serve was in large part itself. This is a feature of the Korean Chaebol model worth understanding. Chaebols are family-controlled industrial conglomerates that operate across many industries simultaneously. Hyundai made cars, built ships, constructed skyscrapers, and operated shipping lines. All of those divisions needed chips. With Hyundai Electronics, the parent organization had a captive internal customer from day one. Hyundai Motor bought chips from Hyundai Electronics. Hyundai Heavy Industries bought chips from Hyundai Electronics, and so on. That captive demand was the thing that made the economics even roughly feasible. Building a chip factory is extraordinarily expensive. The Hyundai Electronics fabrication plant in Incheon, South Korea cost somewhere between $300 and $500 million in 1983 money. That is nearly $1.5 billion today. And this was for a facility that might not produce commercially competitive chips for years. No startup could have done this. The Chaebol structure allowed it because the automotive and shipbuilding businesses were generating profits that could absorb the semiconductor division's losses. So, what was the product? The first chip Hyundai Electronics shipped in 1984 was South Korea's first ever SRAM. SRAM stands for Static Random Access Memory, a fast and expensive type of chip used mainly inside processors rather than as a computer's main working memory. Technically, it was an achievement. Financially, it hardly mattered because SRAM was a small market. The real target was DRAM. Dynamic Random Access Memory is the chip that serves as a computer's main working memory, the scratchpad it uses while running programs. Every personal computer, every server, every workstation needed DRAM. And by 1983, the personal computer market was in the early stages of a decade-long demand explosion as IBM PC clones proliferated across offices and households worldwide. DRAM had a specific characteristic that made it attractive to a manufacturer without strong chip design capabilities. It was a commodity by design. An industry body called GDEC, the Joint Electron Device Engineering Council, defined the interface standard for DRAM chips. That meant any manufacturer who built a chip meeting that specification shipped something that any computer motherboard would accept interchangeably with chips from any other manufacturer. You could not differentiate on design. You competed entirely on manufacturing. Who could build smaller cells with fewer defects at lower cost per unit of storage? For a company with capital and manufacturing ambition but limited proprietary design experience, that was close to an ideal market structure. The problem was that Hyundai's initial attempt to compete in that market nearly ended the company. In 1984, a 64 kilobit DRAM cost around $3. A kilobit is roughly the storage needed for a few lines of text. A year later, in 1985, that same chip cost 20 cents, a 93% collapse in 12 months. That had nothing to do with Hyundai's decisions. It was driven by Japanese manufacturers, Enishi, Toshiba, Hitachi, and Fujitsu, flooding the global market with below-cost chips, a strategy aimed at destroying American competitors like Intel and Micron Technology. And it worked. Intel exited DRAM entirely in 1985. Several American memory companies folded. And Hyundai, which had been trying to develop its own chip designs from scratch while the market imploded around it, found itself technically capable but commercially unviable. Those first 3 years were a failure. The original plan, develop proprietary chips, manufacture them, sell them, ran headlong into two simultaneous problems: immature process technology and a market that had been deliberately destroyed by competitors with deeper pockets and a decade of manufacturing experience. Hyundai was collateral damage in someone else's trade war. So the company changed the model entirely. In 1985, Hyundai shifted to what the industry calls second sourcing. Instead of selling chips it designed, it would manufacture chips designed by American companies under license. Texas Instruments, Intel, and General Instruments had customers: IBM, HP, the major computer manufacturers, who required that any chip designed into their products have at least two qualified suppliers. That requirement existed purely to protect buyers from supply disruptions. If your primary chip source had a factory fire or a production problem, you needed a backup. This buyer requirement for dual sourcing had created a ready market for contract manufacturers willing to execute someone else's design. Hyundai stepped into that role. It took licensed designs from Texas Instruments and Intel, manufactured them in Incheon, and supplied them as second source alternatives. In doing so, it solved three problems simultaneously: immediate customers without having to build its own sales relationships from zero, design files and process specifications it could study and learn from, and manufacturing volume. That last one was the most critical. A chip factory costs nearly the same amount to operate whether it runs at 30% of capacity or 90%. The building, the clean room infrastructure, the lithography machines, all fixed costs that exist regardless of how many chips move through the process. A half-empty factory means every chip it produces carries double the overhead, making those chips uncompetitive. Filling the Ichon plant with second source production turned Hyundai's most dangerous structural weakness into a manageable one. Beyond the economics, the contracts came with knowledge embedded in them. The design files showed what a correctly engineered chip looked like. The process recipes described the manufacturing steps in enough detail to teach principles, even if licensed designs could not simply be copied. And across thousands of production runs, debugging defects, hunting yield improvements, learning which process parameters produce reliable chips and which produce scrap, Hyundai's engineering team was accumulating exactly the manufacturing expertise the company needed. By 1987, 2 years into the second sourcing model, Hyundai had developed its first proprietary chip, a 256 kilobit DRAM. By 1989, it was producing 1 megabit DRAM in volume. By 1992, it was the world's ninth largest DRAM manufacturer. One more part of that trajectory is worth flagging. Hyundai's recovery was not entirely earned. In 1985, Micron Technology, the Idaho-based DRAM maker that had been nearly put out of business by the same Japanese dumping, filed an anti-dumping complaint with the US government. The resulting investigation produced the 1986 US-Japan Semiconductor Agreement, which required Japan to stop selling chips below cost and raise prices to sustainable levels. Micron filed that complaint to save Micron. Korea had nothing to do with it. But the moment Japan raised its prices, Korean chips produced at lower labor costs with government subsidies became suddenly competitive in the global market. The window opened because an American company fought a trade war for its own reasons, and Korea walked through. Understanding that the Korean DRAM rise was partly earned and partly the result of structural luck is important because it is part of what the story actually teaches. Now, there is a reason this chapter of the semiconductor industry's history is resonating again, and it has nothing to do with the 1980s. Decades after Korea ran this playbook, government industrial policy, technology licensing from foreign partners, years of subsidized losses before reaching competitiveness, India is attempting something structurally similar. The parallels are close enough to be instructive, and the structural differences are close enough to be cautionary. The examination is worth its own dedicated look, and we will do it in a future video. For now, let us extract what the story actually teaches. The first thing it teaches is about risk management, specifically about how deliberately Hyundai chose which risks to hold at each stage of its development. When the company tried to compete with its own DRAM designs in 1983, it was absorbing four types of risk simultaneously: whether its chip designs would be competitive, whether its manufacturing process would work at yield, whether it would find customers, and whether it had enough capital to survive long enough to answer all of those questions. It was failing on the first two simultaneously with no clear path to resolving either of them quickly. The second sourcing pivot eliminated two of those risks in a single move. Design risk transferred to Texas Instruments and Intel, who provided the design. Customer risk transferred to Texas Instruments and Intel's existing buyer relationships. What remained was one focused problem: can we manufacture reliably at competitive yield rates? And the company brought every resource it had to bear on that single question, mastered it over 2 years, then selectively reintroduced the complexity it had offloaded. First, proprietary design, then brand, then global direct distribution. This is not bold risk taking. It is conscious risk management, and that distinction matters. We live in a culture that glorifies risk taking. It sounds exciting, it sounds like courage, but the companies that actually compound over decades are rarely the ones taking the most risks. They are the ones being most deliberate about which risks to hold at any given moment and which to offload. This pattern appears everywhere a company has to build a new capability from scratch. Stripe, when it launched, did not build a bank. It built one payment integration that worked. Amazon launched with books, not all of retail. Airbnb rented air mattresses before it rented apartments. The constraint in each case was not narrow vision, it was deliberate risk sequencing. The question to ask at every stage is this: which risks are ours to hold right now, and which can we transfer to a partner, a customer, or a licensing arrangement so that we can focus on the one risk that actually unlocks everything else? The second lesson is about the shelf life of cost advantages. Korea's early edge over Japan in DRAM was real. Lower wages, government subsidies, and the pricing floor that the 1986 trade agreement enforced. For a time, that was enough. But Korean wages rose, as they do in any economy whose industrial development succeeds. Companies that had built their entire position around being cheaper than Japan found themselves steadily becoming vulnerable to the same pressure they had once imposed. Samsung and SK Hynix survived that transition because they used the window of cost advantage to build something more durable. Process technology leadership. In semiconductors, the relevant measure is called a process node. It is a way of expressing how small the transistors on a chip are, measured in nanometers, where smaller means more chips per wafer at a lower cost. Each new generation of process technology that a company masters first gives it roughly 12 to 18 months of structural cost advantage before competitors catch up. The companies that kept mastering each new generation first replaced the labor cost arbitrage with a compounding technical capability. The same dynamic plays out in almost any industry where cost arbitrage is the entry mechanism. Cost gets you into the market. It is not the destination. The discipline is to build the next advantage in process technology, in product architecture, in manufacturing yield before the cost arbitrage closes. Because it will close. It always does. The third lesson is harder to apply but more important to understand. Geopolitics in capital-intensive industries with national security implications is not background noise. It is a structural force that reshapes competitive landscapes on a timeline that matters to individual companies. Three geopolitical interventions shaped SK Hynix's trajectory in ways that no amount of internal execution could have replicated. Korea's government industrial policy created the entry ramp in 1983. The 1986 US-Japan trade agreement handed Korea its cost competitive window caused by Micron's complaint with no Korean involvement, but benefited Korea directly. And decades later, the Korean government's decision to keep Hynix alive through nearly a decade of state-directed debt restructuring was what made the SK Group acquisition possible, which was what funded the high-bandwidth memory bet that is now paying off in the AI era. The companies that understand geopolitics as an input to strategy, that model which policy interventions governments in their industry have motivation to make, and position themselves to benefit from the structural shifts that result, will consistently be better situated than those that treat government action as unpredictable weather. The US CHIPS Act of 2022 and its associated export controls on advanced chip-making equipment are doing something structurally similar to what the 1986 US-Japan agreement did, deliberately reshaping who can compete at the frontier of the industry. The actors are different. The tools are different. The underlying dynamic is the same. The fourth lesson is about the relationship between capital constraints and where in a value chain you can realistically compete. A chip factory is not a startup scale investment. In 1983 dollars, Hyundai's Icheon facility cost between $300 and $500 million, nearly $1.5 billion today. That was before it produced a competitive product. No startup can raise that kind of money without years of demonstrated operating history. Which is why every successful semiconductor startup of the modern era entered through design, not manufacturing. Nvidia, founded in 1993 with $40,000 in founding capital and $20 million in early venture funding, designed graphic chips and contracted their production to foundries. ARM Holdings, founded in 1990, designed chip architectures and licensed them to manufacturers worldwide without ever building a chip of its own. Qualcomm sold wireless technology licenses before it shipped a single product. These were not companies that lacked ambition. They were companies that understood which part of the value chain was accessible to them given their capital constraints, built competence there first, and used it to capture value without needing the $1 billion infrastructure investment upfront. Hyundai could go manufacturing first because the Chaebol model gave it captive demand, patient capital, and structural cross-subsidy from other businesses. The generalizable question for any company entering a capital-intensive industry is this: where in the value chain can I build real competence before I need to raise the capital that only becomes available once I have demonstrated that competence? The answer looks different depending on your starting position. Startups and conglomerates play very different games in the same market. The fifth lesson is about what to hold fixed and what to change when a strategy is not working. Hyundai never changed its goal. The founding mission: build domestic semiconductor capability for Korea, reduce dependence on foreign suppliers, remained constant across 4 decades, 2 near bankruptcies, a name change, and an acquisition. What changed repeatedly and dramatically was the approach. The 1985 pivot to second sourcing was a complete reversal of the tactical plan. The company went from designing and manufacturing its own chips to manufacturing other companies' chips under license. From the outside, it could have looked like abandonment. It was, in fact, the choice that preserved the company long enough to make the original goal achievable. Jeff Bezos articulated this pattern directly: be stubborn on vision, be flexible on details. The companies that hold the wrong things fixed, the product, the approach, the initial customer, in the face of evidence that those things are not working, often fail. And the companies that treat flexibility on details as license to drift away from the mission lose coherence entirely. Hyundai's willingness to become, for several years, something that looked nothing like its ambition, a contract manufacturer executing someone else's chip designs, was the one thing that made the ambition survivable. The humility to be a follower for long enough is often the prerequisite for becoming a leader. That is the founding story. But I will be direct about one thing before we close. The most consequential chapter of this company's history is not the one we just covered. What happened after 2001, the near bankruptcy, the government rescue, the acquisition by SK Group, and then a quite decade-long bet on a type of memory architecture that almost nobody cared about at the time, is the chapter that explains why SK Hynix ended up at the center of the AI wave and not somewhere on the periphery. How a company that had $4 billion in debt it could not service ended up holding one of the most strategically irreplaceable positions in the AI supply chain is the kind of compounding story that deserves its own exploration. We will get there. For now, a company that you probably had never heard of at the start of this video sits at the center of one of the most defining technology transitions of our time. It got there not through a founder's vision or a lucky product bet. It got there because a government decided to build something it did not yet know how to build. A conglomerate absorbed years of losses to develop a capability it did not yet have, and an engineering organization learned one product run at a time across 4 decades how to do something extraordinarily difficult extraordinarily well. That kind of compounding is slow. It is also the most durable competitive advantage there is. Thank you for watching. I will catch you next time.